Chapter 6, Acquiescentia. In part 4 of the Ethics, Spinoza writes that acquiescentia in se ipso is really the highest thing we can hope for. Traditionally, theologians have described a deep human desire to rest in God, an ideal powerfully expressed by Augustine, Anselm, and Aquinas, among others. When 17th century philosophers dismantled the theological worldview of their medieval forebears, they called into question the possibility of ever finding rest. Hobbes, for example, argued in Leviathan that the felicity of this life consists not in the repose of a mind satisfied and discerned in all mankind a perpetual and restless desire of power after power that ceases only in death. In 1661, Spinoza criticized Bacon for assuming that the human intellect is unquiet, it cannot stop or rest, neque consistere aut acquiescere posit, and like Bacon uses the verb acquiescere to signify the mind's capacity for repose. His claim in the Ethics that acquiescentia and se ipso is really the highest thing we can hope for seems to revive the ancient ideal of rest. But acquiescentia in se ipso means resting in oneself, not resting in God. Was Spinoza replacing traditional theological teaching with the humanist ideal of autonomy that would become a defining feature of the modern and enlightened age? Yes and no. Acquiescentia in se ipso appears in the enumeration of the affects in part 3 of the Ethics, and remains an important concept right through the end of part 5. It is also a complex concept since its meaning is comprised of 3 elements. First, there is Spinoza's definition of acquiescentia in se ipso as a joy arising from contemplating ourselves, or in other words, self-love. All love, according to Spinoza's definition, is joy, accompanied by the idea of its cause. So self-love is joy, accompanied by the idea of oneself as the cause of one's joy. The second and third elements of acquiescentia, more implicit but certainly no less significant, are drawn from the word itself. The verb acquiescere carries the sense of acceptance, submission, or obedience conveyed by the English acquiesce, while the Latin root quies signifies stillness, quiet, repose. Acquiescentia in se ipso has then a threefold meaning, combining self-love or joy in one's own causal activity, obedience and acceptance, peace and rest. This threefold meaning indicates the affective experiential character of the freedom, virtue, and blessedness which Spinoza opposes to an unfree, illusory kind of existence, and particularly to an unfree, illusory kind of religion. Acquiescentia in se ipso conveys the feeling quality of the highest human good. It takes its place among the distinctive cluster of concepts that define Spinozist beatitudo. Intuitive knowledge, intellectual love of God, the mind's eternity, and acquiescentia in se ipso. Not surprisingly, given its philosophical richness and semantic complexity, Spinoza's translators have struggled to find an adequate English translation of acquiescentia in se ipso. Translating it literally as acquiescence in oneself leaves out the element of joy that is integral to Spinoza's definition of this affect. Furthermore, acquiescence in oneself suggests passivity, whereas in se ipso echoes the definition of substance as what is in itself in se. And the more we share in the nature of substance, the more active we become. Self-acceptance sounds a little more active than acquiescence in oneself, yet misses the crucial sense of repose and leaves out the important little word in. Marian Evans, who took the pseudonym George Eliot, soon after completing the first English translation of the Ethics in 1856, chose self-contentment, which remains perhaps the best rendering of the acquiescentia in si ipso, and has been revived by Spinoza's most recent translators. Late 19th century translators preferred self-approval or self-satisfaction, while in the 1980s Edwin Curley opted for self-esteem, noting that self-satisfaction sounds a little smug. Our modern notion of self-esteem captures very well Spinoza's definition of acquiescentia in se ipso as a self-love that involves an idea of oneself or an attitude towards oneself. We human beings live in relation to ourselves, with a certain self-understanding or self-awareness, and this reflexivity always has an affective dimension. Yet translating acquiescentia in se ipso as self-esteem neglects the element of quies, stillness and rest. It also conceals the continuity between Spinoza's discussion of acquiescentia in se ipso in parts 3 and 4 of the Ethics and the peace of mind, vera animi acquiescentia, he attributes to the wise person in part 5. Curley uses different English words for acquiescentia over the course of the Ethics, and with good reason, since the meaning of acquiescentia varies according to the epistemic, psychological, and ethical condition of the person who experiences it. Nevertheless, the concept has an integrity throughout the text, which is obscured for Anglophone readers by these shifting translations of acquiescentia. In this chapter, I will leave acquiescentia in se ipso untranslated, in order to retain its integrity while exhibiting its rich and multiple significance. Because acquiescentia in se ipso always involves an idea of oneself, it is an inherently cognitive effect. Ideas for Spinoza are not static images like mute pictures, but acts of thinking that affirm their object. So any idea of oneself is an act of thinking that affirms one's own existence in a certain way. Spinoza distinguishes between three kinds of thinking: imagining, reasoning, and intuiting. And one's idea of oneself can take any of these cognitive forms. When our self-understanding is based on imagination, our acquiescentia is a hollow, volatile, egotistical satisfaction. When it is rooted in the second rational kind of knowledge, it becomes a stable joy that can be shared with others. Within scientia intuitiva, the third kind of knowledge, acquiescentia, signifies the feeling quality of participation in God's eternity, giving experiential content to the apparently abstract idea of intellectual love of God. Just as there is a hierarchy among Spinoza's three kinds of cognition, so there is a hierarchy among their corresponding forms of acquiescentia. In the theological, political treatise Spinoza uses a concept of acquiescentia distinguished by the clearest knowledge to define human blessedness. True salvation and blessedness, vera salus and beatitudo, consists in true peace of mind, vera animi acquiescentia, and we truly find peace, vera acquiescemus, only in things we understand very clearly. The Ethics makes the same argument while providing a much fuller discussion of the acquiescentia that belongs to the inadequate ideas of ourselves produced by imagination. The relationship between acquiescentia in se ipso and Spinoza's three kinds of cognition bears witness to the continuity and coherence of his discussion of acquiescentia on the one hand, and to the polyvalence of the concept on the other. Acquiescentia in se ipso is a single effect always conforming to its definition as self-love, that is, joy arising from contemplating ourselves. However, it is characterized by varying forms of stillness and obedience according to the kind of cognition that produces it. Indeed, these variations are ethical and experiential qualities by which the different kinds of cognition can be recognized and distinguished. For it is through the various forms of acquiescentia that we feel the effects of our self-knowledge or lack thereof within our own being.